Imagine waking up tomorrow in the United States and realizing the internet is gone. Not slow, not glitchy, but completely unavailable for 30 straight days. No Google searches, no social media, no online banking, no streaming, no GPS. It sounds almost fictional, yet short-term outages and controlled experiments have already revealed something unsettling. Modern economies don't just use the internet, they depend on it at a behavioral, psychological, and financial level. Studies on digital deprivation have shown that even a few days without connectivity can increase stress levels, reduce productivity, and force people into unfamiliar offline systems that are slower, more expensive, and often less efficient. But what happens when this isn't just an inconvenience, but a full month-long reality in one of the world's most advanced economies? The answer isn't just about boredom or inconvenience. It's about how quickly daily life, consumer spending, and even human relationships begin to shift under pressure. And when the digital layer disappears, what's left behind is a version of society many people are no longer prepared to navigate. In surveys conducted over the last few years, a majority of working adults say they feel financially stressed despite being employed full-time. That contradiction should raise a bigger question than it usually does. If people are working, budgeting, and still falling behind, then maybe the problem isn't personal spending habits at all. Maybe the cost of a normal life has fundamentally changed, and once you start looking closely, the pattern begins to emerge. Not one problem, but several forces moving at the same time. Forces that individually look manageable, but together create a financial environment that is far more difficult than the one previous generations faced. Today we're going to walk through 6 of those forces. Not theories, not speculation, real structural changes that have quietly reshaped the financial reality of working families. Housing that disconnected from wages, childcare costs that rival mortgage payments, education debt that follows people for decades, health insurance that protects against catastrophe but steadily drains income, a fee economy designed to make prices look smaller than they actually are, and an automated economy that increased efficiency without passing those benefits back to the people doing the work. Individually, each one is frustrating. Together, they explain why so many households feel like they're running faster every year just to stay in the same place. But before we go through them, there's one idea to keep in mind, because it changes how you see everything that follows. The most dangerous part of what's happening today isn't simply that life has become more expensive. It's that millions of people are being forced to spend money even when they're actively trying not to. And once you see how that works, you'll never look at your monthly budget the same way again. To understand how this plays out in real life, imagine a household that would sound perfectly stable to most people. Marcus is a high school teacher. Jennifer is a physical therapist. They're both in their mid-30s. They have 2 young kids and live in a normal mid-sized American city. Not New York, not San Francisco, just a place where most people assume life should still be reasonably affordable. Between the 2 of them, they earn about $91,000 a year before taxes. At first glance, that sounds like the kind of income that should support a middle-class life. 2 professionals, 2 paychecks, responsible careers. The kind of situation older generations often point to as proof that stability is achievable if you make the right choices. But once taxes come out, their combined take-home pay drops to roughly $6,100 per month. That's the actual amount available to run the household. Now look at the expenses. Their rent for a modest 2-bedroom apartment is about $2,050. Not luxury housing, just a normal place with enough room for 4 people to live without feeling cramped. Groceries for a family of 4 average around $1,050 a month. That's not restaurant spending or expensive specialty foods. Just basic weekly trips to the store. Health insurance through Jennifer's employer costs about $1,120 each month for the family plan. Child care for 2 kids at a licensed full-time facility runs roughly $2,250 a month. Then there's transportation. 1 car payment, fuel, maintenance, and insurance together come to around $640. Utilities and internet add another $270. And finally, student loan payments from the degrees that made their careers possible total about $460 per month. When you add all of that together, their fixed monthly costs reach approximately $7,740. Their take-home income is $6,100. That leaves a gap of $1,640 every single month. And that number is before anything unexpected happens. Before a child gets sick. Before a tire blows out on the highway. Before the washing machine stops working. Before birthdays, school supplies, or replacing clothes the kids outgrow every few months. Marcus and Jennifer are not eating at expensive restaurants. They're not taking international vacations. They're not buying luxury products. Almost every dollar they spend goes toward the most basic components of modern life: housing, food, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and education. the core infrastructure of an ordinary family. And it still doesn't add up. When a household runs a deficit like that month after month, the financial problem stops being temporary. It becomes structural. The budget doesn't occasionally break, it starts every month already broken. At that point, there are only a few ways to close the gap. Savings, if there are any, slowly disappear. Expenses get cut further, often in areas like medical care or retirement contributions that people shouldn't really be sacrificing. Or the most common solution begins to appear. Credit. A credit card covers the shortfall in October. A small personal loan absorbs the holiday expenses in December. A payment plan handles a medical bill the following spring. None of those decisions feel irresponsible in the moment. In fact, they're often the most rational choice available. Missing rent or skipping a necessary doctor visit isn't really an option. So the household borrows time. But borrowing time comes with interest. And once that interest becomes part of the monthly budget, next month's math becomes even tighter than the last. This is the quiet financial reality millions of working families now live inside. The system has already anticipated the gap and built a solution for it. It will lend you the difference. With interest, which leads to a question that sits underneath everything we're about to discuss. If the fastest rising costs in the economy are the ones people have absolutely no ability to cut, can we honestly keep calling this a personal spending problem? Because when you zoom out, Marcus and Jennifer's situation isn't unusual anymore. It's becoming increasingly typical, and that's where the first structural force begins. Housing. For decades, owning a home was considered the single most reliable path to financial stability. Work hard, save for a down payment, buy a house, and over time that house becomes an asset, something that grows in value and builds long-term security. For a long time, that formula genuinely worked. But the math behind it has quietly changed. And once you see how dramatically it changed, it becomes clear why housing has become the single biggest pressure point in modern household budgets. If the fastest rising costs in the economy are the ones people have absolutely no ability to cut, can we honestly keep calling this a personal spending problem? Because when you zoom out, Marcus and Jennifer's situation isn't unusual anymore. It's becoming increasingly typical, and that's where the first structural force begins. Housing. For decades, owning a home was considered the single most reliable path to financial stability. Work hard, save for a down payment, buy a house, and over time that house becomes an asset, something that grows in value and builds long-term security. For a long time, that formula genuinely worked. But the math behind it has quietly changed. And once you see how dramatically it changed, it becomes clear why housing has become the single biggest pressure point in modern household budgets. For most of the last century, the foundation of middle-class financial security rested on one simple idea: work steadily, save what you can, and eventually buy a home. That home wasn't just a place to live, it was a long-term asset. As the mortgage slowly got paid down and the property value slowly climbed, families built equity, wealth that could later help pay for retirement, education, or emergencies. It was the financial ladder millions of households climbed, one generation after the next. And for a long time, the numbers made that ladder reachable. In the mid-1980s, the typical home in the United States cost roughly 3 to 4 times the median household income. That ratio matters because it tells you how realistic ownership actually is. When a home costs 3.5 years of total income, saving for a down payment and qualifying for a mortgage is difficult, but possible. A household can realistically work toward it over time. Fast forward to today, and the relationship between incomes and housing prices has shifted dramatically. In many parts of the country, the median home price is now 7 to 9 times the median household income. In high-demand cities, that ratio climbs into double digits. Suddenly, the same ladder that previous generations climbed has been stretched twice as tall. Even before you consider interest rates, the entry point alone has moved much further away. The practical effect is simple. Many families that would have bought a home in earlier decades are now forced to rent for much longer than they planned. Some stay in smaller apartments than they prefer. Others move farther away from their workplaces, trading lower rent for longer commutes. And many end up spending significantly more than the long-standing guideline that housing should consume no more than 30% of household income. That 30% rule, by the way, was established decades ago when the price-to-income ratio looked completely different. In a world where housing costs 2 or 3 times more relative to earnings, the rule quietly stopped matching reality, but it was never fully replaced with a new one. For households like Marcus and Jennifer, this creates a financial paradox. Renting keeps the roof over their heads, but every rent payment disappears the moment it's made. It doesn't build equity. It doesn't create an asset. It simply keeps the household stable for another month. Meanwhile, people who already own property benefit from rising home values. As prices climb, their net worth increases automatically. The home they purchased years ago becomes more valuable even if nothing about the house itself changes. That difference between owning and trying to enter the market slowly widens the gap between two groups of people. Those who bought earlier continue building wealth through property appreciation, while those trying to enter later face a higher and higher barrier every year. Housing, in other words, has quietly become one of the strongest engines of wealth inequality. Not because someone designed it that way, but because the math drifted so far from where it once was. But housing alone doesn't explain why household budgets feel so strained. The next force is less visible but often just as expensive. It's something millions of families pay every month simply to keep two incomes in the household. And strangely enough, it's paired with a bill from decisions made nearly 2 decades earlier. Childcare and student debt. Two completely different costs from two completely different moments in life, yet together they create one of the most powerful financial traps modern families face. The next pressure point in the modern household budget is something that doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, often years apart, until two completely different financial obligations collide at the exact same moment in a family's life. On one side is childcare. On the other is student debt. They come from different chapters of adulthood. One is tied to raising children. The other traces back to decisions made at 18 years old. Yet both share a critical feature that makes them especially difficult to escape. They are costs you pay simply to participate in the modern economy. Start with childcare. For most families with young children, full-time childcare isn't optional. It's the price of maintaining two incomes. Without it, one parent often has to leave the workforce entirely or reduce hours significantly. And in a world where housing, healthcare, and education costs have already climbed, losing one paycheck usually isn't a workable option. So families pay. In many parts of the United States, full-time licensed childcare for two young children typically falls somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500 per month, depending on the state and the facility. In some areas, it's even higher. Think about what that number means in practical terms. In many regions, that monthly bill rivals or even exceeds a mortgage payment. Families are effectively paying the cost of a home every month just to be able to go to work. The most honest way to think about it is this. Childcare has become a kind of participation fee in the labor market. If both parents want to earn income, the system charges a monthly toll. If you can afford it, you keep both incomes. If you can't, one income disappears. And that financial setback tends to hit middle and lower income households the hardest. Now layer student debt on top of that. For many people who attended college, the monthly payment on student loans ranges somewhere between $350 and $500 per person, though the exact amount varies widely depending on the size of the loans and repayment plan. In households where both partners went to college, that can mean $700 to $900 every month, leaving the budget before anything else gets paid. Unlike childcare, which at least serves a current purpose, student loan payments often feel like a bill from the past. It's money being paid today for a decision made years earlier, usually under a widely repeated promise. Borrow for education now, and the increased earning potential will make it worthwhile later. For many graduates, the degree did lead to better jobs, but the financial payoff hasn't always matched the cost of the loans required to get there. And here's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Student debt doesn't just take money out of the monthly budget. It also affects something lenders watch very closely when deciding whether someone qualifies for a mortgage: the debt-to-income ratio. That ratio measures how much of a household's income is already committed to paying debt. When the number is too high, lenders become reluctant to approve a mortgage. So the loans that were supposed to enable better careers, and eventually home ownership, sometimes end up becoming the very thing that delays buying a home. In other words, the investment meant to build the future can end up standing in the way of it. When you combine the two costs, childcare and student loans, the monthly impact can easily land somewhere between $2,700 and $3,400 for a typical dual-income household with young children. That's comparable to a second mortgage. Except unlike a home loan, these payments rarely build any lasting asset. They simply reset every month. By the time the internet finally comes back online after 30 days, you might expect a sense of simple relief, as if someone flipped a switch and life just resumes where it left off. And on the surface, that's exactly what happens. Phones light up, notifications flood in, banking systems sync. Deliveries resume their normal speed. Platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Netflix come roaring back into daily routines almost instantly. But beneath that rapid return is something far more complex and far more telling about human behavior and economic dependency. Because when systems restart, people don't come back exactly the same. In the immediate aftermath, there's a surge, a kind of digital rebound effect. Economists and behavioral analysts have observed similar patterns after temporary disruptions. Pent-up demand gets released all at once. Online shopping spikes. Streaming hours jump. Communication intensifies as people try to catch up on everything they missed. Businesses that survive the blackout often see a short-term boost in activity, almost like a compressed version of a month's worth of transactions happening in days. Financially, it can look like a rapid recovery, but that spike doesn't tell the whole story. What's more interesting is what happens after the surge fades. For some people, the 30-day experience leaves a lasting imprint. Studies around forced digital breaks suggest that a portion of users, though not the majority, become more conscious of their online habits. They may reduce time spent on social media, turn off non-essential notifications, or rethink how often they rely on algorithm-driven platforms. The absence of constant connectivity, even if initially uncomfortable, reveals something important. Not all digital engagement is equally valuable. And once that awareness sets in, it doesn't fully disappear. But here's the tension, and it's where the story becomes less idealistic and more realistic. For most people, dependence doesn't decrease, it deepens. Because the 30-day disruption doesn't just highlight the downsides of the internet, it exposes how essential it has become to functioning in modern society. Work efficiency, financial management, access to information, even basic convenience, all of it snaps back into place the moment connectivity returns. And with that comes a renewed appreciation, but also a reinforced reliance. The systems people struggled without are the same systems that make life scalable, fast, and economically viable. Once you've experienced the friction of living without them, the incentive to fully disconnect almost disappears. From a business perspective, the lesson is even sharper. Companies don't walk away from a disruption like this thinking, we should rely less on the internet. They think the opposite. We need stronger, more resilient digital infrastructure. Investment flows into backup systems, redundancy planning, and diversified communication channels. The goal isn't to reduce dependence, it's to protect it. Because in a competitive economy, stepping back from digital efficiency isn't really an option. At a broader level, this kind of scenario forces a reevaluation of risk. Governments, institutions, and corporations begin to ask harder questions about infrastructure vulnerability. What happens if the outage isn't accidental, but intentional? What if it lasts longer? How do you maintain financial stability, supply chain continuity, and public communication in a prolonged digital blackout? These aren't theoretical concerns. They're strategic ones, and they shape policy decisions long after the crisis ends. And then there's the human takeaway, the part that doesn't show up neatly in economic data. For 30 days, people are forced to operate without the invisible layer that usually connects everything. They experience slower decisions, fewer distractions, some discover a sense of clarity or focus that constant connectivity had quietly eroded. Others feel the weight of isolation, inefficiency, and missed opportunity. Both experiences are real, and both leave a mark. But perhaps the most important realization is this: the internet isn't just a tool we use anymore. It's an environment we live in. Removing it, even temporarily, doesn't just change behavior. It exposes the underlying structure of modern life. It shows how much of what feels natural today is actually built on a system that didn't exist a generation ago. So when everything comes back online, life doesn't simply return to normal. It returns with awareness of both the power and the fragility of the systems we depend on. And that awareness creates a quiet, lingering question that doesn't go away. If 30 days without the internet can reshape how we live, spend, work, and connect, then how prepared are we really for a world where that connection isn't guaranteed? And that question, quiet, almost uncomfortable, is where this story truly lingers, because it forces us to confront something deeper than just technology or economics. It forces us to examine dependence in its purest form, not addiction in the dramatic sense, but structural reliance, the kind that builds slowly, invisibly, until it becomes indistinguishable from normal life. The 30-day absence of the internet doesn't just disrupt systems, It reveals how those systems have reshaped human expectations. Speed becomes assumed, convenience becomes standard. And once those expectations are set, anything slower begins to feel like loss. What makes the United States such a compelling case study is not just its scale, but its optimization. This is an economy designed for immediacy. From same-day delivery to real-time financial transfers, the system rewards those who move fastest and punishes delays. Remove the internet and that entire rhythm collapses into something far less efficient and far more human. Decisions take longer, mistakes happen more, and the margin for error widens in ways that modern systems were specifically designed to limit. But here's the paradox that financial analysts often wrestle with. Inefficiency, while costly, can also create resilience. During those 30 days, as digital systems fail or slow down, people begin to rebuild layers of redundancy, not through advanced technology, but through behavior. They keep more cash on hand. They memorize important phone numbers. They establish physical meeting points instead of relying on constant communication. Businesses print records, diversify suppliers, and rethink just-in-time inventory models. None of these actions are new. In fact, they're old solutions to problems we believed technology had already solved. And yet, as soon as the internet returns, many of those behaviors begin to fade. Because efficiency is seductive. It saves time, reduces effort, and scales opportunity. The very habits that create resilience often get abandoned the moment they're no longer necessary. This is where the long-term impact becomes uneven. Some individuals and businesses hold on to what they've learned, integrating small changes, backup plans, diversified tools, a bit more caution. But at a systemic level, the pull toward optimization is stronger than the push toward preparedness. There's also a generational dimension to this shift that becomes impossible to ignore. For younger Americans who have never experienced a world without constant connectivity, the 30-day blackout feels less like a disruption and more like a dislocation. It's not just that tools are missing, it's that an entire framework for navigating life disappears. Older generations who remember pre-internet systems often adapt more quickly, not because the situation is easier, but because it's familiar. That gap highlights something critical. Digital literacy has, in many ways, replaced analog resilience. From a financial journalism perspective, this is where the narrative moves beyond observation and into implication. Because what this scenario ultimately exposes is a trade-off that sits at the core of modern economic growth. The more efficient and interconnected a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. And the more society leans into that efficiency, the harder it becomes to step back, even when risks are clearly visible. So the story of living without the internet for 30 days in the United States isn't just about survival or adaptation. It's about exposure. Exposure of how deeply integrated digital infrastructure is in shaping behavior, markets, and expectations. It's about understanding that what feels like progress often comes with hidden dependencies. And it's about recognizing that resilience doesn't always come from moving forward, but sometimes from remembering what was left behind. Because in the end, the internet didn't just change how people live, it changed what people consider livable. And once that line moves, it rarely moves back.